Computer number one is working. It says it's working. And this computer's working, so I think we're okay. So good. I'll step over this way so I can actually see people rather than stare through a tripod. Good evening to everyone. Thank you all for coming. I wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up because we have a holiday around the corner. Yes, another one. We are now into spring holiday-ish season. So we had Tu B'Shvat, very minor, low-key holiday, but we are coming up now on the holiday of Purim, less than a month away. And after Purim, we get Pesach a month later. After Pesach, we get a bunch of modern holidays of Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, Yom HaAtzmaut. We'll go over them, don't worry. And then, 49, 50 days after Pesach, we get Shavuot. And then we get a break again for part of the summer. So we're coming back up into the intense time period. And that means we got to know what's happening with Purim. And I didn't want to put it off because some things you may want to begin planning or figuring out how you want to handle. So let's get to Purim. So first of all, we have to understand where the story of Purim takes place in the great timeline of Jewish history. So after the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians in 586 BCE, the Jews were taken east, at least many, many of them. Now the Persians eventually destroyed the Babylonian Empire. And when the Persians did that, they said, everybody who the Babylonians took can go home. Right? The Persians had a very tolerant policy of allowing different nationalities, ethnicities, religions to be somewhat autonomous, sort of on their own within the Persian Empire, as long as you were loyal to Persia. So many Jews went back to the land of Israel, and that's when you get the rebuilding of the temple eventually and all of the rest. But many, many Jews stayed right where they were in Babylon, and many others went from Babylon the other direction. They went further east. They moved into Persia. They moved into the headquarters of the Persian Empire. The Jews who were there said, the Persians are nice. They let us be Jews. This is a good place to make a living. So we'll stay here in the heart of the Persian Empire rather than heading east. And indeed, the story of Purim takes place in Shushan, known as Susa in Persian, which was the Persian capital at the time. So that is the heart. This is now in modern day Iran. If you were to go look for Susa today, you'd have to take a trip to Iran. I don't recommend that at the moment, but maybe it's some other time. Iran used to be a very welcoming and good place for Jews as well as many others. That changed with the revolution in '79. Okay, so let's just do a quick overview of the story, because a lot of people remember the story of Purim, if you remember the story at all, in kind of a cartoon version. But the story is actually a very adult, a very sophisticated tale. It is found in the Tanakh, in the section of Ketuvim, the section of writings, and in the book of Esther. Esther, of course, being the Persian name of the main heroine of the story. So, Achashverosh, or Ahasuerus, if you want to use the sort of Greek English pronunciation, he was the leader of the Persian Empire. And the story begins with a huge party, and he gets rid of his favorite wife at the time, who was called Vashti. And he eventually gets a little lonely, and so it's suggested to him that he should find a new wife, because nothing takes the edge off loneliness like getting married to some new girl. Except in Persia, they did things a little different. It wasn't like he went on Tinder and then had to swipe one way or the other and get picked. He basically sent out people who picked the prettiest women they could find, and those women were then taken and brought to him. Oftentimes, this is portrayed for the kids as kind of a beauty contest. This was no beauty contest at all. This was abduction. The girls did not get to say no to an invitation from the king. And so the women are taken. They are brought to the palace. He then systematically sleeps with each of them, just going through the process of trying to find the one he likes. Like I said, this is not a romantic story at all. And in the process, he comes across this girl named Esther, or her Hebrew name, which is Hadassah. And she seems to be not only beautiful, but also incredibly likable. And this young woman of Esther then becomes his new favorite wife, and therefore receives the title of queen rather than concubine. All the other women who he has now raped over the time, they go into the harem, and he can have them whenever he feels like it. That this was what it was to be king in Persia. With me so far? Noticing how this is definitely not a G-rated movie. Okay. Now, Esther has a relative named Mordechai. And Mordechai was her cousin uncle. It's a little unclear from the text, but definitely he is not directly her father. Her father was named Avichail, but instead is somebody who was looking after her. It seems as well that Mordechai is in the large Persian government bureaucracy. He does seem to have some sort of government standing because we find him often engaged in the area where the government took place. So it does seem that he has some position within the bureaucracy, which was not unusual for Jews in the Persian Empire at that time. With me so far? All right. Like I said, there's 10 chapters. You should read them all, but this is the short version. Ahasuerus then appoints a new guy to be his number 2 in the kingdom, and his name is Haman, or Haman. And this is the villain. This is the main antagonist of the story. Haman gets very upset because as he goes around, everybody is supposed to bow to him because he is number 2. And yet, as he goes around, this one guy, Mordechai, does not bow down to him. That makes Haman really, really mad. Now, pause real quick. We're not going to go into too much of the subtleties of the story because we can save that for another class. Why didn't Haman bow down? Or sorry, why didn't Mordechai bow down to Haman? Any ideas?
We don't bow to people. We only bow to Hashem.
We don't bow to human beings. We only bow to God. We only bow to God. So that means if you live in England and you are invited to an audience with the Queen, you wouldn't bow down before Her Majesty? Because I'll point out there are many Jews who live in England who are each year honored with either a title or a knighthood, and they come before the Queen and they bow. As a matter of fact, according to Jewish law, if you study in the Talmud and the rest of Halakha, Jews do bow to royalty and other important people, especially when there is danger involved. So there are many authorities who critique Mordechai for not bowing. There are many who also apologize for his lack of bow, saying that what Haman did was he had idols on his robes, and therefore Mordechai didn't want to look like he was bowing to the idols. But one way to read this whole story is that Mordechai was actually making a power move to try and challenge Haman's position. And in a way, he sucked Haman in, playing off his pride, playing off his temper, into a challenge. Now, this, of course, as many commentators point out, creates great danger for the Jewish people. Excuse me. Let's make sure this isn't a technical problem. It is not a technical problem. And so that the story begins to unfold. So Haman decides that he wants to get rid of the Jews because Mordechai is a Jew. This is the first time, by the way, that we get the term Jew used in the entire Jewish Bible. Before that, we are known as the Ivrim, right? The Hebrews from the time of Abraham. But after our experience in the land of Egypt, we have become Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, the people of Israel. And then later on, we are members of the kingdom of Judah or the kingdom of Israel in the north. And it is because of the name Judah in the bottom that we become Yehudi, that we become the Judites in the eyes of many foreigners, because it was only the Judean kingdom that was still around when the Babylonians did their conquest. So we finally meet somebody who's called a Jew for the first time. He's giving grief, and Haman decides to kill all of them, right? To kill all the Jews, not just to kill Mordechai. And that plan is set in motion by him going to the king and flattering the king and basically lying to the king, saying there are people who don't follow your rules because, we do have kind of our own rules. Didn't ask which rules, Haman, but the king Ahasuerus is not exactly the smartest person to be ruling. And Haman then bribes the king by giving him a ton of cash and saying, and now I'll take care of this problem for you. This idea of sort of tax farming or a sheriff farming, which was common throughout many different countries, is a very normal thing. The king doesn't want to deal with the minutia. You give him a stack of cash and he gives you permission to do what you need to do, and you can keep the extra. That was a very common system throughout many parts of the world for many, many millennia. So the Jews are then a little concerned that in about a year's time, they are going to be exterminated. And remember, exterminated from the kingdom of Persia means exterminated from just about the face of the earth, because Persia rules all the way from the border of India all the way to Ethiopia. It is a massive, massive empire, and it is an empire in which you find 99% of the world's Jews at that time. So this is very much an existential threat to the entire Jewish people, not only to a part of us. So what to do? Well, Mordechai has an idea. Who do we know who knows the king who might be able to help? Esther. So he goes, and with a whole series of go-betweens, he eventually gets the word to her that there's this problem. She says, yeah, but what am I going to do? And he says, well, you got to go. And she's like, I can't go without being invited, because if I show up uninvited, I die. Because that's how Persians lived. You know, if you show up to the king, even if you're his queen, if the king didn't invite you, you get killed. By the way, you may notice, just as a little aside of some of the literary beautiful literary flourishes of this book, that Esther is trying to show up when the king hasn't invited her, unlike his first wife, Vashti, who wouldn't show up when he did invite her. So there is this inversion of the personalities between these two people. And of course, for the purpose of what's going on. So she eventually does go. And when she goes, she sets up this plan where she is going to essentially isolate the king, because he was the kind of person who would listen to other advisors, and she wanted to have his undivided attention, so no one could talk him out of this. She isolates him along with Haman. She eventually exposes Haman. But before that happens, Haman is upset that Mordechai still won't bow. So he says, before I go to her party and have this wonderful time with her and the king, I'd like to kill Mordechai. So he goes and he waits to talk to the king. Because remember, he can't just go and talk to him. He has to wait until he is summoned. So he's there, pacing outside. The king can't sleep. The king asks for a review of the great things people have done. And in that review, they mention, well, you know, there was this guy named Mordechai once who saved the king from assassination. There was a plot, Mordechai informed, and that saved the king. There were always plots for assassinating Persian kings. So he says, well, how did we reward this guy? And they say, well, the book says we didn't do anything. So he's like, well, what should we do? I don't know. I'm only king. Who are my advisors around that I can ask? They say, well, Haman's hanging outside. So they say, bring him in. Haman, how should the king honor somebody? And Haman thinks, well, he's probably talking about me. And so Haman gives this whole big spiel about what you should do. You should let him wear your clothes and let him ride your horse, and have somebody, official walk in front of him saying, woo, this is the guy the king wants to honor. And the king says, great idea. You do that for Mordechai the Jew. So this is the point in the story where all the readers are going, oh dear. Haman is now coming down off of his heroic arc. He was rising up in style. He was coming to this massive power, and now his own pride has brought him low. And indeed, he goes back and he is devastated by this. And then he goes to the party. And then not only is he having a bad day, but now it becomes terrible because Esther reveals that she's Jewish. And Haman is now like, I am so dead. Right? What are you going to do? He begs for mercy. The king misinterprets his begging as being an attack on the queen. And so eventually the king says, kill him. Because again, another nice advisor says, well, Haman had a big spike that he was going to stick Mordechai on in his yard. Why don't you put Haman on the spike instead? And Ahasuerus follows the latest suggestion and does that. He gives Mordechai great power. They are able to pass a new law that allows the Jews to defend themselves against their attackers. They do. And we have a new holiday. Let's celebrate. That is the short version of the 10 chapters of the book of Esther. Any questions on the story overview? We're going to get into what does it mean, and we're going to get into how do we celebrate next. But I want to make sure you at least are familiar with the story of the book of Esther, because it's a part of the Bible that if you're not Jewish, you may not have actually read a whole lot. And even if you are Jewish, you may not have been paying attention when it was being read, partly because it's often read only in the Hebrew, and many people don't speak Hebrew well enough to understand everything that's happening. So we're all good? It's okay to ask questions. It's very Jewish to ask questions. All right, I guess I gave the best explanation of the story of Purim ever. Come on, there we are. So what is this story about? Well, one of the main topics the story is about faith, but specifically about faith in the diaspora, faith when we are outside of Israel. Because you may be thinking, well, wait a minute, it's in Persia. And all the other stories were in the land of Israel. Story of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, story of David and Solomon, all those good guys. Okay, we had the little side trip to Egypt, but everything else has been very Israel focused. Now we're off in Persia. This seems a little weird. And not only are we in Persia, but we are in Persia after the destruction of the first temple, after the fall of our kingdoms, after we had been a nation, and that we now should be in the state of ultimate degradation, which was usually what happened to conquered countries. How do we view life? How do we view our relationship to God? How do we view our relationship to our faith? What do we do? How do we save ourselves when we are now floating amongst the non-Jewish empires that can just destroy us with a flick of their wrist? And we don't have an army that could stand up to any of this. And the answer comes in chapter 4, when Mordecai is trying to convince Esther to go talk to the king. And he says to her, Mordecai had this message delivered to Esther. Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. I don't think you can just hide in the palace while the rest of us get slaughtered. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house, meaning your father's lineage, will perish. And who knows, perhaps you have attained to royal position for just such a crisis. Mordecai isn't a prophet, more or less. But what he does seem to understand is that it is rather coincidental that just as the greatest threat to Jewish survival rises since the destruction of the first temple, there happens to be somebody who is perfectly positioned to save the Jewish people sitting in the king's palace. That seems almost like it is a divine act. But what we don't have in the story of Purim is God. You can read through the entire 10 chapters of the book of Esther. You will never find God's name. You will never find a reference to God in any way, shape, or form. There are different ways that commentators will see implications of God and much else that can be said about that. But as far as an explicit name, title, or reference to God, there is simply none in all 10 chapters. God is hidden, if you will, throughout the entire book of Esther. And what happens? While God is hidden, we act to the best of our ability with what we believe God wants us to do in those moments. So Mordecai can say with confidence, God's not going to let us die. He doesn't actually say God, he just says, we will not be destroyed by this. And I don't know how we're going to get out of this, but something will happen. That is the faith that the Jews who lived in the diaspora needed for the last 2,000 years. Because living under circumstances where you don't know how you're going to get through the next crisis, the next disaster, the next problem, requires a great deal of faith, especially when you don't have an explicit message or messenger from God that's telling you, this is what you should do, this is what's going to happen, here's the miracle I'm going to do for you. It is not coincidental that Purim is the last of the holidays. The first holiday is Pesach. The first holiday is Passover. And Passover is, of course, the most miracle holiday ever. That's why they make movies out of it. They don't make a lot of movies out of the book of Esther. There is a very nice one called One Night with the King. It still, of course, takes liberties with the story, but at least it has the right feel for it. But the story of the Exodus, there's going to be a plague. Wow, plague. There's going to be another plague. Wow, plague. It's all about proclamation, prophecy, fulfillment, massive miracles that are changing the world. The humans are basically going along for the ride. God is very, very revealed in the story of the Exodus. In the story of Purim, which is, if you follow the cycle of holidays, the exact last holiday, but only 1 month removed from the holiday of Passover, is exactly the opposite, where it is all about humans trying to figure out what's the right thing to do when we don't have God telling us, this is what's going to happen, this is what you should do, here's the miracle I'm going to perform. Instead, the miracles are performed by us, the miracles are revealed by us. That is to say, someone like Mordechai can say, this was a miracle. God didn't proclaim that Esther being in the right place at the right time was a miracle. Mordechai recognized it as a miracle. It is up to us to recognize God's miraculous presence in the world, even when God is not doing it in a Cecil B. DeMille, Hollywood-style, special effects sort of way. We good? Good. But did it really happen? That's the question everyone likes to always ask, so I'm going to go ahead and try and take care of that. The biggest answer is, we don't know. That is to say, third-party confirmation is a little thin. However, there are some clues that the story of the Book of Esther is most likely grounded within historical events within the Persian Empire. So what we have here is a chart of how Ezra 4, that is to say the chapter 4 of the Book of Ezra, describes the different kings of the Persian Empire. And then on the far right side, you can see how we actually write them in Hebrew or pronounce them in Hebrew. And then you have how the Greeks talked about them. And then you had how the Persians talked about their own kings. And then you have the Aramaic spelling or pronunciation of many of those things. Aramaic, of course, being the sister language to Hebrew and the much more common vernacular language among the Jews in many, many times and places. Aramaic, for example, is the language of the Talmud. Aramaic is also the language of the Kaddish. In a modern American sense, Aramaic was kind of like their English. Hebrew was still a sacred language, but their day-to-day language was Aramaic. Much like for us, Hebrew is our sacred language and our day-to-day language is English. It's just English and Hebrew are a lot further apart than Aramaic and Hebrew, which are much more cousins. So if we look down, let me move over here so I can point. If we look down at our Ahasuerus, or Ahasuerus, if you want to read the Greekish type of pronunciation, most likely lines up with Xerxes. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, that and that don't look or sound alike in any way, shape, or form. Well, partly that's a problem because the Greeks mutilate the names of people from other cultures, much like we do in English. Right? We take words from other languages, we stuff them into an English blender, and we make them English side. Well, my favorite example from having lived in 3 years is, what do we call that thing where you get up there with a microphone and you sing a song in front of a bunch of people? What's that? Karaoke. Not karaoke, right? Karaoke is the American English mutilation of how the Japanese word sounds. And, that's fine. That's what languages do. We borrow words from other languages and then we make them naturalized for our own style of pronunciation. And trust me, the Japanese do exactly the same thing. That's why they drink biru, which is beer, right? Because they make it fit the Japanese pronunciation style. Okay, so how do we get to Xerxes? Well, Xerxes in the Persian is, and I apologize to any Persian speakers here, is Cheshayasha. Right? So what happens is they drop off the ch because there's no such thing in the Greek, and they end up with the sha at the end becoming an s because the Greeks really like to put s or us as an ending for names, and they end up with Xerxes. But if you look over in the Aramaic and the Hebrew, right, we have Ahashverosh or Hashirash, which is very, very similar, or Hashiarsha. Right? We have very, very similar Aramaic readings of the name Ahasuerus or the actual Persian name, which sound actually a lot closer to the Persian than the word Xerxes does. So it is pretty likely that the emperor that's being described throughout the book of Esther is actually what we would call in English Xerxes. Everyone following the basic structure there? It's okay if you're not, because it's not terribly important, because we don't actually have like Wikipedia entry for the guy from the time that can say absolutely for 100% sure, but historically this does seem to be likely. And there's a couple other bits that make this work. One of them is from Persian inscriptions from the time of Kheshayarsha that stated that he ruled from Hidush and Kushia. Now, Hidush and Kushia are mentioned at the very beginning of the book of Esther of Hodu and Kush, right? Hodu is the land of India and Kush is the land of Ethiopia. And so this is exactly the same way that our book talks about his realm, and it matches the way their own inscriptions talk about his realm. Now, if we do the timeline, if we look at the math, Xerxes reigned from 486 to 465 BCE. And then if we take that and we map it onto the events of the story, well, the first party, the party when Vashti had all the trouble, happened in the third year, according to that first chapter. That would be around the year 489 BCE. Sorry, I missed, that's not correct. That was in the 483 BCE, because you do the numbers down. Esther was then chosen in the winter of the 7th year, as the second chapter tells us, which would be 479 BCE. Now, 479 is a very important year in the time of Xerxes. Why? Because that's when he had just lost to the Greeks. You may remember that whole idea of the Persians attacking Greece. That happened in 479. So the image is of him coming back after this failure to conquer Greece, with his tail between his legs, if you will. And yes, he is a little depressed. What's going to cheer him up? A brand new girl, plus a few other hundred. So this seems to be part of his recovery. And what do we know? We know that indeed that he returned to Susa, to Shushan, when he returned from that failed conquest of Greece. So that does seem to work with our timeline. We also know, according to Greek records, because no Persian records survive of this period, that Xerxes had a wife called Amestris. Now, there was no record of his wife called Vashti, but we do also know that the Greeks didn't like the Persians, remember that whole war thing, and they also didn't really like women. And they described Amestris as being a cruel queen who slaughtered her enemies. Well, what did Esther do? She killed her enemies, right? The people who were trying to kill the Jews were killed by her instead. Now, if you are the kind of culture that does not think women should have any power at all, and you hear about a foreign queen that is using her power to destroy her enemies, you're probably going to make fun of the other person. You're probably going to call her all sorts of horrible names because that's not what women are supposed to do. So that is indeed how the Greeks describe her. Now, they say, the Greeks, that she was born from a military commander known as Otanes, and it doesn't exactly say that she was Jewish. Oh dear. However, we do know that Esther's father, according to the book, is Avichail, which it literally means my father, a warrior, a military person. Now, just as Esther had a different name, Hadassah, he may also have been called something similar to Otanes. That is to say, his Hebrew name might have been Avichail, and just like her Hebrew name was Hadassah, her Persian name was Esther. He may have had a Persian name of Otanes. We don't know for sure, but it is in the realm of possibility. And why might we think that Amestris was indeed Esther, since after all, Amestris and Esther don't sound all that similar? Well, actually it is. So Amestris, with vowels and consonants, the consonants are highlighted because those are the important letters in those languages. The is ending, as I mentioned, is a Greek form, like the S in Xerxes. So you can basically drop that out because that's what the Greeks put on to make it fit their language. So now we have an emister. Well, the core letters of Esther, the st, right, those are indeed the exact same as the core letters of Esther. Those are the same core letters. And Amester, right, the st is an identical form apart from the m at the front. And indeed, a m at the beginning was a very common cognate letter. It was a letter that was used to begin a lot of different words in many different languages that was extra in addition to the core root letters of a word. So the idea that Amester would fit actually fits the name Esther pretty closely as you might expect between three different languages going from Hebrew to Persian and Persian to Greek. And if you've ever put anything through Google Translate 3 times, you can know that it can get a little warped. But this actually is pretty close and quite supportive of the idea. This is an interesting little footnote to all of that. If indeed Xerxes is Ahasuerus and Amestris is indeed Esther, then their child, Artaxerxes, would be her child, and that is indeed the person who, according to Ezra and Nehemiah, helped with the rebuilding of the Second Temple. So it might be kind of interesting if the Persian emperor, who was very favorable to the Jews, had a Jewish mother, even though he was sitting on the Persian throne. But we're not 100% sure. Okay, any questions on that before we get to the what do we do now? Okay, what do we do now? There are 4 mitzvot for Purim. There are 4 deeds that need to be done in order to fulfill our obligation and our celebration of the holiday. We'll talk about these each in detail, but let me just go through the list to start. The reading of the Megillah, Dikra Megillah, the sending of gifts, Mishloach Manot, the gifts to the poor, which are Matanot LeEvyonim, and the Purim feast, the Seudat Purim. Let's talk about each of those. The reading. Everyone, this is taken from Rambam, Mishnah Torah, the codification of Jewish law from about 1,000 years ago, but it's an excellent summary. Everyone is obligated in the reading of the Megillah, men, women, converts, and slaves. Children should also be trained to read it. Even Kohanim, the priests, should neglect the temple service to come hear the reading of the Megillah. It's a big deal. Right? I know it may seem, because we do it in such a party atmosphere and because it's done with a lot of excitement and joy, that it may seem frivolous, but this is a big deal if it is more important than even doing the sacrifices on the altar. The story of Purim is a very central idea within the Jewish faith. This Purim is read both in the night and in the morning. A lot of people only come to the night reading, but actually the morning reading is considered more important. For those of you that are interested, we do the evening reading here on March 9th, I believe it is this year, and we'll have a dinner afterwards as well. If you want to come to the morning reading, we do a community reading at the JCC Jewish Academy Morning Minyan, which is down at the Maitland campus, Maitland Avenue, Maitland Boulevard, and that starts at 7:45 a.m. Sorry, but we have to do it before people go to work. So if you would like to join us, please do. Hearing it is the same as reading. So that means that if you, for whatever reason, can't read it yourself, you can at least attend and hear it, and then that counts the same as having read it yourself. By the way, you can read the Megillah, if it's the only option you have, in any language that you understand, as I'll explain in just a second, in the privacy of your own home if necessary. It's always best to be together, but you shouldn't neglect the reading of the Megillah just because you can't join with others. And it is best to read from a proper scroll, and a Megillah scroll is written in much the same way as a Torah, meaning there are no vowels, there are no cantillation tropes, everything has to be learned and practiced in advance. As I mentioned, we have options with languages. One who speaks a language other than Hebrew and hears the Megillah in Hebrew, written in the Holy Script, fulfills his obligation, even though he does not understand what is being read. If it was written in Greek, he also fulfills his obligation, even if he does not understand. It's a little side note that has to do with the fact that the Greek rendering of the Bible was considered to be sacred because it was done in a nearly miraculous way at the time of the Septuagint. Whole nother story, ask me later. If it is written in Aramaic or another language, one fulfills the obligation only if the language is understood. So yes, there is something special about hearing the Megillah in Hebrew, even if you don't know Hebrew. But if you don't know Hebrew and you hear someone, or if you don't know Spanish, you hear someone chant the Megillah in Spanish, you don't get credit, right? You need to have comprehension at that point. Still good? All right. Feel like we're racing through, but we're doing fine. So let's get to our second mitzvah, Mishloach Manot, gifts. According to the very end of the book of Esther, 9:22, it became an obligation of sending portions one to another. Now, these are gifts. Like I said, we'll talk about gifts to the poor in just a minute, but these are gifts that you give just to friends. And so everyone would give something. Traditionally, it was to send 2 portions of meat and 2 other cooked dishes, or at least 2 other cooked foods, or 2 other foods that a person would say different blessings on. as your gift. Nowadays, you'll often find people giving little bags or little boxes full of fruit and chocolate and maybe grape juice or wine if you're lucky, and people will give those to each other on the day of Purim. It's a wonderful, wonderful mitzvah to do and very tasty. This mitzvah is known as mishloach manot, as I mentioned. If you do not have the means, let's say you're too poor, and back in the day, this was a more common problem, you can't even have enough food for yourself. How are you going to give something to someone else? What you would do is you'd find someone else who was in need. You'd give them what you had made for you. They'd give you what they had made for them. And now you have given, right? And you both end up with actually having something to eat. So this was a good way to make sure that even if you couldn't normally spare food, you could still fulfill this particular mitzvah. Clear? Okay. But of course, there were some people who were just poor and needed help even above the gift that you might give them of the mishloach manot. And so that's why we have the mitzvah of matanot le'evyonim. One is obligated to distribute tzedakah to the poor on the day of Purim. At the very least, to give each of two poor people a present, whether it be money, cooked dishes, or other food based on the gifts of the poor. Again, mentioned from chapter 9 of the book of Esther. We should not be discriminating. Don't say, well, does he really need it? This is not where you ask for checking out their tax forms before you give them the gift. Instead, you should give to whomever stretches out their hand. That doesn't mean you have to give to everyone, but it means whoever stretches out to you first, who says, hey, can you help? You don't ask any additional questions. You give freely, even more than you might on another day on this holiday. Feasting. This is the one that everyone likes and everyone gets wrong. Yes, we have a feast on Purim. What is the nature of the obligation for the seudah, for the feast? A person should eat meat and prepare as attractive a seudah, a feast, as his means permit. He should drink wine until he becomes drunk and falls asleep. Very importantly, the halakha, the law is very clear. We do this during the day, not the night. A lot of people seem to think that whole get drunk thing should happen during the evening reading of the Megillah. Not true. We're going to come back to that in more detail because this is a problem in some communities. Thankfully, our community's been pretty good, but I want to make sure that we prevent anyone from getting off on the wrong foot. But there are some people who take the idea of getting drunk very, very seriously and very, very incorrectly. There is a time to celebrate and to drink to excess, to enjoy in a particular way, but it has to be done at the right time, in the right way, and especially not being dangerous. Why is that? Well, before we get to that, let's make sure we have the right balance of what we should be emphasizing. Like I said, many people emphasize the drinking and the feasting more than they emphasize the giving. Well, Rambam, in his usual wisdom, tries to tell us something a little bit different. It is better to be more liberal with their donations to the poor than to be lavish with their seudah or sending portions to friends. Right? Let's imagine you've got $100 to spend on the holiday. Do you spend $99 on the party and $1 on the poor? Or do you maybe rebalance that a little bit? Well, there is no greater and more splendid happiness than to gladden the hearts of the poor, the orphans, the widows, and the converts. One who brings them happiness resembles the Shekhinah, which is a phrase for God's presence, to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive those with broken hearts. If you really want to be happy, help those who need help being happy. That is what is going to make your holiday better than having a nicer dinner or nicer wine. He goes on to say, when a person eats and drinks in celebration, but locks the gates of his courtyard and does not provide for the poor and bitter souls, his happiness is not the happiness of mitzvah, of a commandment, but the happiness of his gut. Such happiness is a disgrace based on a quote from Malachi, the prophet Malachi, I will spread dung on your faces, the dung of your feasts. Strong language, right? The idea here being, what is dung of a feast? Well, that's if you made a feast for yourself while there were other people going poor, especially on a day when you were commanded to help the poor. So on Purim, we need to make sure that we are not only thinking about the party, but the party is fun and great, and we should do that too, right? It is one of the commandments. It's just not one that should be at the expense of all the others. Questions, comments? Okay. So let's talk about drinking in more detail. Like I said, this is a topic that gets very much, can be misunderstood. It's also a topic that has caused a lot of trouble on college campuses, where people will drink to excess and claim that it is their religious obligation. So where does this idea that it's an obligation come from? Well, it comes from the Talmud, Megillah 7b. Said Rava, a man is obligated to drink on Purim until he no longer knows the difference between cursed Haman and blessed Mordechai. Rabba and Rabbi Zera celebrated the Purim meal together. They had the Seudah. They got drunk. Rabba arose and slaughtered Rabbi Zera, right? He actually killed him. The next day, he prayed and revived him. The following year, Rabba said, would the master like to come and we will celebrate the Purim meal together? Basically, I know I killed you last year, but how about if you come again? And Rabbi Zera said, a miracle does not occur every hour, which basically means I'm not going to count on a miracle keeping me alive again. Right? You killed me last year, and now you're inviting me again. What happens if you get drunk and there is no miracle this year? Right? Then I'm dead, rather than just mostly dead. So this is where the idea that drinking comes in. Now you'll notice in the original, it doesn't just say get drunk. It follows it up immediately with a story of someone who got so drunk that they committed one of the worst sins possible, the sin of murder. Do you think this passage is saying, just get drunk and do what you want? No. What this passage is trying to say is that there is a strong encouragement to celebrate on Purim, especially given that the holiday, that the events that led to the holiday were based around drinking parties. Achashverosh had a drinking party, and then Esther put together 2 parties. So there is a reason why this is especially associated with Purim, but you need to do it in a way that doesn't leave people dead on the floor. And indeed, many different rabbinic authorities over the last few hundred years, 1,000 years, have had different ways to read this. What does it mean to get drunk on this topic? So I'll just run you through them very quickly because I want to make sure that we have time for a few more things. So the Bach says one is literally required to become so intoxicated that one can't tell the difference between blessed is Mordechai, cursed is Haman. It's the only way to explain the killing, because how else could you have ever killed someone if you were not so blind, stinking drunk that you couldn't even tell the difference between cursed and blessed? The Beit Yosef and Tosfot. Beit Yosef, by the way, is the author of the Shulchan Aruch, one of the great Jewish law codes, said it in fact means you can't recite the full song. Cursed is Haman, blessed is Mordechai, cursed is Zeresh, and blessed is Esther, cursed are all the wicked, blessed are the Jews, which is a bit of a tongue twister of a song. And once you're drunk enough that you can't do the song, now the bartender can cut you off. Rabba's statement is not meant to be taken literally. There was not a literal death that happened. The Agudo said it's until you can't do the gematria. Gematria is the system of using Hebrew letters as numbers. And if you do the math, cursed is Haman, blessed is Mordechai. If you add up the letters in each of those phrases, they each equal 502. When you're so drunk that you can't do that math, you're drunk enough. Now, for most of us, that means like before we lift the first glass, because doing that math is not exactly easy. But that's the idea that he brings. The Kolbo says no drunkenness at all, because if you get drunk, you might sin. And a little drinking, however, can increase in making the poor joyful and comforted. So yes, you can have a little drinking, but don't actually get drunk. Sfat Emet says it just means to rejoice and drink continually, not continually meaning drunk, but that drinking should be part of your full meal rather than just one drink and stop. The Ramah says, also in the Shulchan Aruch, that some people say that drinking enough to put you to sleep is plenty, because while you're asleep, no one can tell the difference between blessed is Mordechai, cursed is Haman, because you can't tell the difference between anything if you're snoring. And the Mishnah Berurah, which is a very recent commentary, says it's like the Ramah, but you should only drink as much as will not keep you from failing to do other mitzvot. Very real concern is if you get drunk, you may not remember what to do next, or you may be passed out and not do what is next, the other parts of your mitzvot. So drinking has officially always been reined in by almost all the authorities. Unfortunately, in this day, there are still many people who err on the side of caution in this idea and only this idea, and somehow think that they're obligated to get blind drunk and become a danger to themselves and others. Please do not be one of those people. It is absolutely possible to have every bit of fun on Purim without losing yourself. All right, so what other things go into Purim? Now, these are not actually parts of the mitzvot, but they are little changes that we do in our liturgy, in our prayers. We add in a prayer called Al HaNisim. If you were looking at the Siddur during Hanukkah, you would have seen a similar paragraph that talks about our victory during the time of the Maccabees. We add in a paragraph that talks about our victory during the time of Haman. We do not, however, recite Hallel. Hallel is a selection of Psalms from 113 through 118. We do not recite that on Purim, although we do recite that on other major holidays. And a couple different explanations are given. One, reading the Megillah is kind of like doing Hallel. We're reading from the book of writings. We are reading in a way that reminds us of joy and deliverance. We don't need an additional reading. Another explanation. The story of Purim did not bring about redemption. It just prevented destruction. But the story of Hanukkah, by the time we finish that story, we're free. The story of Exodus, by the time we finish that story, we're free. The story of Purim, by the time we finish that story, we're still alive. But we're not actually free. Right? We're still part of the Persian Empire. We still do not have our full independence. So although we are absolutely ecstatic to still be alive, always good, it doesn't quite rise up to the level of being a full deliverance. And then part C, the victory happened outside of the land of Israel. That when we say Hallel after the time of the Exodus onward, we say it only for an event that occurs within the state of Israel, or whether it applied to all the people of Israel is another issue. Hamantashen, everybody's favorite Purim cookie, are also called Oznei Haman, which are Haman's ears, which just goes to show you our ancestors had a better sense of humor for naming their pastries than we do. These cookies are often filled with fruit or other filling. They are actually only about 300, 400 years old. The Hamantashens were very common throughout all of European society, not just Jewish, during the 1700s, and they were usually filled with poppy seeds, and they were called Montaschen, which in German means a poppy pocket. Well, we heard Montaschen, Homontaschen, we made a pun, and we associated them with the holiday of Purim, and we've been making them ever since. So, Jews are really good at word games. And so when we heard Montaschen, it was just obvious that these were destined to be part of our holiday. And they became very popular. And of course, there are other treats that can be served as well. But Hamantashen is the most symbolic of this holiday, emblematic of this holiday. We also, you'll see, having a carnival. We have our carnival the day before Purim this year on a Sunday so that more of our kids can attend. And just as we have private feasts for the mitzvah, we also will do a community activity. And there'll be games, and there'll be activities, there'll be prizes. It is a lot of fun. If you want to volunteer at the carnival, let me know. If you want to just come and play some of the games, it's okay. Tickets go on sale soon. It is also very common for people to wear costumes. This is our Halloween, if you will, of Jewish holidays, meaning that people will dress up in costumes, both children and adults. You are welcome to dress in a costume if you come to the carnival or if you come to the Megillah reading. I'll be in costume. You have to wait and see what. But this is a very meaningful part of the holiday as well, not only fun, because most of the story was all about people not being who they seemed. Right? Ahasuerus was this mighty king who was actually very weak and did what other people said. Esther was this meek, mild little girl who just did what everybody said, but at the end turned out to be this magnificent queen. She was also somebody who kept her Jewishness under wraps, wearing a costume, if you will, while she was in Ahasuerus' house. Haman looked like he was this wonderful, strong, amazing guy, and it turned out that he had this uncontrollable pride and temper that led to his downfall. Again, Mordecai looked like he was going to die, and it ended up that he turned out to be the victor and took over Haman's place. So this whole nothing is as it seems attitude feeds into the costumes on Purim very nicely. And that is Purim in a very, very quick 50 minutes. Questions? Comments? Yes. What about the fast of Esther? So the fast of Esther is a custom that has been around now for some time, that in honor of Esther's bravery, she asked the people of Shushan, of the city, to fast, the Jews, for 3 days before she went to see the king unannounced. And in honor of that, people will also fast on the day before Purim. It's considered to be a minor-ish fast, but yes, it is a very nice way of remembering that bravery. Yes, thank you. Other questions, comments? Okay, then those of you who are staying for the 7 o'clock class, stretch your legs, get a drink of water. I know I will, and we'll be back in just a minute. In one stream, start a